So Bismillah. So Alhamdulillah, you're in California. We're very honored to have you here, very happy to have you.
Alhamdulillah, honored to be here.
Alhamdulillah. And we were looking at like the things that you've been working on, mashallah. You've been become an expert in many fields. And I think one of the things that really stands out about you is that you've gotten a background in your Islamic studies, then you also are really interested in tasawwuf. You're also interested in the idea of Islamic politics. So I want to hear, like, where did you even start? If you just take us back to like your childhood, your upbringing, and what brought you here all the way.
Okay, so Bismillah, Alhamdulillah. I was born in Pakistan, in Karachi, and I moved to Saudi Arabia when I was about 12. But my father was in Saudi Arabia since I was born almost, and so we spent most of our time there. That was outside of school, and then we moved there. So my schooling, high school, you could say middle and high school, was in Saudi Arabia, and then I came to the United States in 1994. And or rather beginning of 1995. And I think that my family, the circumstances in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia, just seeing both the suffering and the potential and thinking about what was happening. I think one formative moment for me was, if we go really way back, it's in the 80s, the ethnic conflicts in Pakistan, in Karachi, that made me really think about social movement, social power, and its use and abuse. So I had a close sense of what was going on in Pakistan, even though I was a child. And as I moved to Saudi Arabia, different circumstances, but I was, because of my family background, religious, and really concerned about the Ummah. As you know, in the 80s, a lot of things are happening. There's Afghan Jihad going on. There's Iran-Iraq war going on. And in the 1991, the first Gulf War happens, which is, I think, a turning point for me. I remember having this nightmare in my apartment building in Jeddah, that the Americans have attacked us. Even though the narrative was that the American troops were going there to protect Saudis, but the real sense that you had at the core that we as an Ummah are no longer protected because we have a non-Muslim army in the Holy Land. Wow. And a lot of Muslims felt that way. But for me, it was very personal. It was a recurring nightmare that the American planes have come and bombed our apartment building. So there was this sense that the Ummah is, on the one hand, there are signs of hope and strength. As you know, in the 1970s and 80s, there was the Sahwa, reawakening of the Ummah. That's when the masses of the Ummah became religious. Obviously, 1979 Iranian Revolution, all of that played into that. But then in 1991, there was this divorce, if you will, between Muslim governments and Muslim societies that began to take place, because the Saudis, as they decided to invite the Americans, the Muslim societies became split. The governments were also split. Most decided to go with Saudi Arabia, but only because of both carrot and stick. In reality, the societies and the Muslim societies felt that there was a betrayal. And then what happened in Iraq in the decade of 1990 was sanctions and basically a kind of mass murder of Iraqis by the Americans through this inhumane sanctions. And as you know, famous interview clip that circulated in 1998, Madeleine Albright was asked, do you think the murder of 500,000 children, Muslim children, right, our people, and that's how I felt about it, though people can choose to otherize because they were Iraqis. when she was asked if this was worth it, she said, yes, it was worth it. There was no identifiable policy objective for war in Iraq. Really, there was none. There was no threat to the United States. But despite that, the life of 500,000 Muslim children was worth it. And that's something that Westerners say as part of an argument, as a gotcha argument, Democrats against Republicans or the other way around. But Muslims were worthless. The Muslim life was worthless. And that had a deep impact on me. That how could it be that the Ummah of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the people who have the guidance, people who are supposed to have this honor and care for each other, that we have invited an army that has killed 500,000. And that was just what they admitted. What was happening on the ground was far worse. And so we had abandoned Iraqis, the Ummah, right? But that was just the beginning, because then we were going to abandon the Afghan and then Gaza.
Right.
So you could say that that was a formative moment for me, a very personal. Kashmir was another cause that I grew up with, and I remember as a high school student thinking about it and really crying in anger, like helplessness, that we can't do anything.
And were all of these different issues, like, did you hear about it from your parents a lot, or was it something that came from your own heart?
A good question. I think there was a lot. Alhamdulillah, I grew up in a community that was poor but rich in many other ways. There were people that were trying to do children's programs, including folks from Jamaat Islami and from Tablighi Jamaat and others. So I had a lot of interaction. My cousins and uncles, and my own parents are religious. My mother, I think also, my mother and grandmother played a very important role. My grandmother was a religious preacher, self-taught scholar, and a very, very smart individual who had this very strong sense of religion. My mother had a very strong sense of Ummatic love. So I know that those things had an effect on me. But it wasn't just those things. I think that I was fortunate to both see suffering, but also kind of like what people are seeing in Gaza today, that they see suffering, of course, nothing like that, but they're also standing with each other.
Right.
And I saw, in other words, I loved Muslims. Like, these are my people.
Yeah.
And it's not like other people are not my people, but this is my family.
Right.
And moving around Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and then the United States. The United States, in Madison, Wisconsin, is where I went to school, and the masjid was, a lot of students from all over the world. And I felt that this was amazing. This is like, I had friends, graduate students at the university from all over the world who were mature enough that they knew what was happening in their countries. Many of them were runaways because they were hunted down by their governments for, praying in the mosque or something like that. This is 90s were very oppressive, increasingly. So I felt that was my real education in the Islamic Center in Madison, Wisconsin. That's where sort of this culminated, because I felt that I found my identity there, ironically, in the middle of this small Midwestern town. But in terms of, having access to Arabic language and the Quran and history, those things were part of my education. So I never thought that I'd be doing Islamic studies. I came to the West not because I thought I'll find Islam here. I came because I wanted to be a nuclear physicist. I wanted to unify the forces and, something like Nobel Prize worthy, because that was my passion.
Well, was that connected to the Ummatic vision that you developed up to that point?
I think so. Yeah, there was this sense. I was proud of what Abdul Salam, the Pakistani physicist, had done, and Abdul Qadir Khan, who had built up this Pakistan's nuclear program. But this sense that science was what you needed to fix the Muslim world and our problems. And of course, when I came here and I thought about it and I studied history and political science, I took courses and I talked to people, I realized it was a very private realization of an undergraduate student that it's not science. It's not science that's the problem, because if science needs a society, it needs demand, it needs certain kind of independence of thinking, it needs some kind of support and stability, curiosity. Those are all things that come from somewhere else. Right. They are pre-scientific commitments. They come from the heart. A society commits to it. A civilization commits to those things. And I thought we were missing those, and we needed those first. So even though I still love science, but I felt that those were the things that I needed to think about. So I went and studied. After I finished my bachelor's in nuclear physics and engineering, but I went on to do master's in social science at the University of Chicago. And that was another world, a whole world of Western social sciences, which are undergoing their own crisis and fragmentation. And there is a problem of Orientalism, how Islam has been studied by the Westerners, and how that has become part of Muslims' own self-understanding, right? So for me, it was a very strong realization, which is what I wrote about, an article that became ironically quite famous. One of my most well-read articles was what I wrote in my master's at that time.
What is that one called?
It's called Talal Asad and Islam is a Discursive Tradition, Talal Asad and His Interlocutors. And it was really a way to challenge the way Islam was being studied in the West. And so my graduate degree came out of that, because I wanted to study Islam classically and I wanted to study independently. So that's where I began to do Islamic intellectual history and just read early sources looking at this question. Put simply, my question was, what went wrong?
Like Bernard Lewis.
Bernard Lewis, because after 9/11, that was all the rage. This idea that, this great Western Jewish Zionist doyen of Islamic studies had figured out what was wrong with the Muslim world, and his answer was, you guys are just angry at us because we won, you lost, right? It was almost kind of a childish answer, but the thing is that it has such purchase in the Muslim world, because he was a historian and he did hit on something really important, which Muslims are asking that question. So for me, the question became, I need to understand this question of what went wrong, where, and more importantly, were Muslims able to understand what went wrong? So I wanted to understand how Muslims understood what went wrong, rather than through a lens of modernity. So that's where I discovered Islamic political thought and Islamic theology and Kalam, and its relationship to questions that are fundamentally political. And by political, it's a very important part, I think, in my own discovery, is that when you think about politics, usually people think of something dirty. It's horse trading, it's maximizing your personal interest or the interest of your group and whatnot. But the word political, as it was initially conceived by Plato and Aristotle and so on, it was a noble word that was trying to solve the problem of collective action by saying that political, how can it be that a lot of people, people from different families and tribes live together and they have something that they share, the city, the polis, and what they do is good for them and for polis at the same time. What are those actions that they can do that are not a zero-sum game? Basically, that's what political meant to Plato. That zero-sum game means my gain has to mean your loss. If I win, my neighbor has to lose, my other tribe has to lose, maybe my even cousin has to lose. But this idea of political philosophy was what was good for everyone. Right. And their fundamental premise was that, this was a Western political philosophy, that you cannot be a good human being outside of a good community. So there is no such thing as successful or flourishing as a human being without being part of a community that also flourishes. So this way of thinking was what political meant, the best of political philosophy. And so the question for me going into Islamic sciences was, what would be Islamic political philosophy? Now, typically, if you look at what Westerners were calling Islamic political philosophy, was basically a translation of Aristotle and Plato into the Arabic language that happened starting the 3rd century of Hijrah, and that becomes the dominant tradition. But there was very little Islam in there. If you read Al-Farabi, it's brilliant, it's interesting, but it's commentary on Aristotle. Where is the Prophet ﷺ? Where is the struggles of Islam? Where is the companion's vision of this is Khilaf al-Rashida? Where is the Quran in there? Where is Abu Hanifa's struggle in his vision? This is halal haram. Where is that fiqh? Where is the Abu Hanifa? Where is Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah? These were the people that formed the core of Islamic religious tradition that was grounded in the Quran and the Sunnah. But that's not what you find in a typical treatment of Islamic political philosophy or Islamic politics. Typically, these are considered jurists that didn't do politics.
They were just involved with the, not with the government-related stuff, but everything that's other than government.
Or, put differently, they were concerned only with law. So, even when they were concerned with politics, they were concerned just with what the Sharia law said. Whereas this idea of a political vision of what is good for everyone, that was done by Greeks and those who inherited the Greek philosophy, the Neoplatonic philosophers, the Hellenistic philosophy in the Muslim world. So as I encountered this problem, my attempt was to say, well, I want to recover or uncover, disinter, if you will, the Islamic political philosophy, which means I have to go to books that don't say political or siyasa, maybe in the title, but you have to look at theology, you have to look at jurisprudence, you have to look at the tafsir literature, you have to look at how even sometimes the polemics about what happened in the first fitna between the companions of Prophet ﷺ, how people understand that this is where they're thinking about what is good for everyone and what the vision of Islam is, what the vision of Ummah is. And from that, my book on Islamic political thought came, from that discovery of what went wrong, but to do so from within. And also, ultimately, my question was not really to look for what went wrong, but rather what were the sources of strength in our civilization by which we can self-critique. Because I think that I was, and I think I still am somewhat different from a lot of my colleagues, Muslim colleagues in the West today, who are largely interested in defending Islam from Orientalism. I was not interested in that. I almost felt that Orientalists are just not worthy of even refuting. Because we had something bigger and better to do. We have to think about how to recover our strengths. And Western propaganda, Western attack, misunderstandings, and sometimes brilliant insights and discoveries that Western academies have made, all of those are interesting, but they are not our real in other words, our real narrative when we're doing scholarship should not be, oh, you guys got this wrong about Islam and Islam is good.
Right, like apologetics.
Apologetics, right? But so for me, the question was, you guys, you're guests, great, thank you for pointing out these books. You stole a lot of our books, preserved some, commented on some, but your job is done.
Right.
I'm much more interested in what's real.
Right.
And what's real is this is God's message, and this is the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, and we have to think about what have been our internal dynamics of where did what we got right and what we got wrong as an ummah. So internal critique. And that was sort of where, now all of that is the background to where Ummatics came from. Ummatics, literally, you could say it rhymes with politics, right? And that's sort of what it means as well. Politics was the science of what is good for the city, the polis. So Ummatics is the science of what is good for the ummah. Not the individuals only, but the ummah as a whole. How do you solve the, collective action problem? You familiar with this collective action problem? In political science, right, the issue is that if in a public park, let's say, which everybody uses, but who takes care of it? Who pays for it? I have my children, I take care of them, right? I have maybe my backyard, I take care of it. But who takes care of what belongs to everybody? That's a collective action problem. Another way of looking at this problem is, if you heard of that story, it became very famous in sociology, and in the West, a woman is raped in the middle of a busy public square, and nobody calls the police, nobody does anything. Why? Well, that's a collective action problem. Everybody thought it's somebody else's problem, right? So that's happening in Gaza.
Right.
But that was happening in Kashmir, that happened in Iraq, that happened in Afghanistan. So it's not new.
It's been around for a long time.
It's been happening over and over and over.
When would you say that started, or when would you say it started going on the decline, where we'd have that collective action problem?
I think that with the dissolution and the abolition of the Caliphate, 1924, is when it becomes a formal problem.
Right.
Right? Before that, you could say that maybe the Khilafah was in decline for a century before that, but there was hope, and there was at least a center you could blame. There was a place to go to, which was historically connected all the way to the Prophet. That's what Khilafah means. Literally, Khilafah is successorship or deputyship to the Prophet ﷺ. So the ruler has the authority of the ruler. The foundation of the authority of the ruler comes from their attempt to their claim to follow the Prophet, their claim to care for the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? That's their basis of their legitimacy. But once that's gone, what's the legitimacy, source of legitimacy of these various statelets that were created by the British and the French? What is the source of their authority? Right. So that's where we see that Muslim political situation spirals down. That rulers are they find their source of legitimacy in secular nation-state ideals that they are importing from the West, but they have no purchase within their own populations that go against some of the fundamental teachings of the Quran, most of all Islamic brotherhood. The sense of the Ummah, which is at first very strong, but it's dissolving because the nation-state demands loyalty to an imagined nation that has been created, and the Ummah stands in the way. The Ummah is not my problem. Right. So if you're Egyptian, Sudan is not your problem, Palestine is not your problem. If you're Pakistani, Afghanistan is not your problem. Muslims in India are not your problem. Kashmir is not your problem. That's what, unless it becomes a national problem or national cause. But theoretically, the nation state stands in direct opposition to the idea of the Ummah. So that's what is happening. Since 1924, the symbol that could have been saved and re-infused with significance was lost. Right. And history matters, right? The fact that this thing had gone on for hundreds of years, 1,300 some years, and the fact that Muslims had, unanimously Muslim scholars, the Orthodox Muslim scholars, had believed in the obligation of the Khilafah. And so much so that in our books of jurisprudence, so many problems are simply dependent explicitly on, if your wali dies, then who takes care of these children? Waliul Amr. If the father is no longer there, mother is not there, nobody take care of them, jurisprudence says Khalifa. For the Hanafis, even the Jum'ah, Salatul Jum'ah, right, the most important feature of our religious life, right, a fixture, a fundamental thing that, if you're not religious, there's one thing that you got to do to go to Jum'ah. That's not valid except by the permission of a Khalifa. So my point is that our jurisprudence is empty without.
Right, it's heavily dependent upon the idea of a leader, of a Khalifa. So when you take that out, that system out, then you're left with a lot of rules that are difficult to apply.
That do not close, meaning that you have endless fights then, because there's nobody to make that final decision, which is part of the law, part of the legal system. That could be whether we're going to decide Eid this way or that way, or whether we're going to, the time for Fajr is going to be 18 degrees or 15 degrees or what have you. Of course, there's jurisprudence problems, but sometimes the final decision has to be made by a Khalifa. So it's there in the jurisprudence, but it's also there in the Aqidah. It's found in early centuries. This is found in books of Aqidah. And so that's the theoretical, if you will, background of where Ummatics came from. And more practically, the Arab Spring 2011, 9/11 happens, and Muslims basically become targets of this global war on terror. And this global war on terror, which becomes a license to persecute your Muslim problem, to solve your Muslim problem in any way you like. It's a license given to governments, tyrants all around the world by the United States. China, India, Myanmar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, anybody who has a Muslim problem, call them terrorists and do whatever you want.
Right.
It's a free get out of jail card. And so Muslims are oppressed, and Muslims have been in the last few decades, but now Muslims are just hunted down without any reprieve for say 2 decades after that. And then 2011, Arab Spring happens, which is also very personal to me. I was there, Tahrir Square in Egypt in 2011, talking to people about what their vision was, and it disappointed me that there was not an Islamic awareness. The discourse was kind of empty. You felt that
it's still nationalistic.
It was actually very interesting. It was nationalistic and secular to some degree, but it was naive and all over the place.
Right.
And very easy to manipulate. And I felt that Muslims aren't ready. Muslims were, if you talk to people, even the more mature politicians, they would say our problem was Hosni Mubarak. There was one bad guy. We had a bad egg. And this was so naive because this was happening to every country in the global south. The crony capitalism, the unequal system of capital accumulation in the center of the world, the Western countries, and exploitation and corruption. Since it was happening everywhere, but there was this lack of awareness. There was lack of preparation, I felt, and so that, and then of course what happened after that, the massacres, the counter-revolution, made me think that we needed an alternative vision for the Ummah. Where what I had thought about in my seminars and in my books needed to come out, because it wasn't, I no longer, when you go to grad school, you think that you have all the time in the world to think. I realized that I no longer had 50 more years to improve my thinking and write more books. But in the meanwhile, I was doing other things, as you said, whether I was translating Madarij al-Salikin, and I was working on contemporary movements as well. But these were the key moments that led me to write the article, Who Wants the Caliphate, which sort of launched the Ummatics Institute eventually.
Very nice, very nice. It's a very interesting background. And if we go back to like the 70s and 80s when these thoughts are forming, what were your impressions at that time, like when the Afghan Jihad is happening and then you have the situation happening in Iraq? Are you, like Muslims at that time, especially in the regions that you were in, where are they gravitating towards? Is there, because at least at that time there was more external expressions of Islam, and people were looking at Afghanistan as an example of them going against an occupying power.
Mm-hmm.
So what was that like? And were you disappointed with what happened after, or was it just a natural progression from there?
Disappointed in
basically the following years after the Soviets were out. Then what happens in Afghanistan? There's decades of problems
in fighting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, that was. I came to, if you will, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in late 70s, so in the 80s, toward the end, when you basically, on the one hand, saw this heroic victory, and then also saw why military prowess and military resistance doesn't take you all the way. That you needed something else. You needed discourse of unification, of integration of different groups. If people were fighting for tribal reasons or maybe Islamic reasons, but they were, sectarian, divided along sectarian and ethnic lines. And if Islam is not a strong enough force to unite people, then our victories all disappear. And so, that was a recognition that a lot of people had. And I think that there was the hope that this is temporary, that we'll figure this out, right? But after 1991, first Gulf War, there is this enormous sense, I think the Muslim world felt, which we sort of became used to, but there was a sense of great insult. Like there was a time when Muslims felt some level of self-respect, I think, which is gone after Saudi Arabia invites the American army in the Holy Land, which they used to say that non-Muslims are not even allowed in these Holy Lands. Now you have an army, and that army is there to protect against another Muslim army, right? So it's there. And it turns out later, to add insult to injury, that those pictures that were shown of Iraqi accumulation on Saudi border, on the basis of which the King Fahd was persuaded, were doctored. So you were so helpless, and
I feel like you've been fooled at that point.
You've been fooled.
Yeah.
And then you basically subjected the entire Muslim world and Muslim population to so much misery on the basis of American designs and whims.
Would you say that was the turning point for how Muslims felt about America? Because before that, the Americans were supporting the Arab Afghan people, financially at least, and then after they turn against them, is that when people start feeling negatively towards America?
Yeah, I think that is true. So the third world countries, global south, even, since going back to the beginning of the 20th century, if you remember Roosevelt's 14 points in which a lot of hope was invested, and people thought that America was different. It was not like the British and the French, who were imperialist. Americans are different. Now, reality was very different. America had its colonial project in Philippines, which didn't work out, and America sort of didn't need it. But there was this idea that the Americans are different. And then, which is also why when oil is discovered, the Saudis go to America, and so on. After the Second World War, then Americans move in and replace the British and the French. And that is, I think, when Americans begin to fundamentally transform, basically take on British policies, but in the Cold War, still, basically 50s and 60s and 70s, Americans they use the Muslim world as a chessboard, right? So topple this guy, kill that guy, but in the naive way in which population thinks, right? Our general impressions are never very sophisticated. Like, we have a sense of these guys are good, those guys are bad.
Right.
So the sense generally was the Americans are, whatever else they may be, they're better than the British. And also they were using Islam to fight against the Soviets, leftist forces in the Muslim world and elsewhere. So that is why the Americans supported Islamic movements, or felt that Islamic movements could be used. Now, of course, instrumentalization never works as you think. You may be doing it for one reason, or somebody else is, benefiting or thinking of a different reason. So Islamic movements are very much indigenous, and they have their own logic. But in the 70s and 80s, Islamic movements they have the left, which is atheistic and is a problem for Muslims. But American and Muslim interests come together, and that's why there is a generally positive view of Americans, which kind of it changes. In '79, what happens with Iran? But Iran are Shia, and maybe Sunnis are able to set that aside, that example. But there's hostage crisis, and first America tries to topple democratically elected government in 1954, and after that there was other problems with the United States. But on the whole, America is better than the Soviets. But 1990, 91 is when that begins to change.
Got it. And when 1979, that's when the Iranian Revolution happened. So is that a moment where a lot of Sunni Muslims were happy that at least, even if they're Shia, at the end of the day, they're replacing a government that was much more secularized?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. In the middle of the 20th century, there is a lot more relationship between Shia and Sunni. Okay. They're reading each other's literature. Sayyid Qutb is read, Maududi is read in Iran. Wow. And Muqtada Sadr and other Shia authors are read in the Sunni world. And there is a sense of camaraderie against the colonizers and against secular forces. But when the Saudis become big players on the scene, and after 1979, after Iranian Revolution, and then there was some internal revolution or rebellion attempt within Saudi Arabia, basically, and also Faisal is assassinated, King Faisal, rahimahullah, who was the last good king, Saudi king, I think of it. And after that, basically, Americans have the Saudis. Not as much as they do now, but they are able to control the Saudi royal family much more. And so the Saudis become, they're obviously the Wahhabi background with a very strong anti-Shia sentiment, which wasn't very prominent before when Iran was not a Shia power. But as soon as Iran becomes Shia power, Khomeini also has very strong rhetoric that is very antagonistic. So it puts Sunnis on edge, it puts Saudis on edge. But America, Iraq, Saddam's Iraq attacks Iran in the middle of all this. As soon as the new Islamic revolution is completed, and that sort of changes the game. Now, why that war happened, there's a lot there, but basically, the research that I've seen shows that it was one man's ego, Saddam Hussein. He attacks Iran. 1 million people are killed on one side and almost 750,000 on Iraq's side. So a devastating war which Saudis and Americans are backing Iraq in helping destroy Iran. And this also basically pushes Iran to an extreme, because Iran has to choose between complete annihilation or coming together against this Sunni evil. So Iran becomes more radicalized, and the Sunni powers become more, basically the United States just playing this Cold War game in which Sunnis and Shia are being divided, and within the societies there is a war between the left and Islamists that Americans are supporting Islamists in, and then as soon as Islamists are they're objecting to American designs in the region after 91, they become the enemy as well. So this is the progression in which American policy, as it unfolds in the Muslim world, the Middle East, it becomes more and more draconian.
Right. Very interesting. And so during that time, it seems like you'd realized this idea of the American empire, which a lot of people are realizing right now within the past 2 years with the Gaza situation flaring up and becoming much more popularized. So at that time, what made you decide that you want to come to America to study? Because people would think that, okay, if you're living in that side of the world and you've seen America as the empire that's destroying the lives of a lot of Muslims, then why should I go live there? Why should I go pay taxes?
Well, that's an interesting question. Remember, I'm a kid, and I come right about the time when these views are changing.
Right.
Right? In the 90s. Like, we don't know what was happening in Iraq.
This is all like retrospect. Now it's easy to say.
There is a sense of fear that you have, that there is something wrong with American army in the Holy Land, in Saudi, in the Hijaz, in the land of the Prophet ﷺ. But on the whole, it wasn't not nearly as antagonistic as it became after 9/11, 2001. And hands down, I think most people don't realize, and American Muslims don't realize, science and knowledge, the universities in the United States, which are being dismantled now, is one of the most exceptional things that any civilization has produced ever. The amount of knowledge and advanced knowledge that is available and that is being disseminated. I mean, that's how China got strong. That's how India got strong, right? To come to the American university, which now Americans have turned against. But it really was an exceptional institution in history. And it still is. I'm speaking of it in the past because I think it's in sharp decline. Right. So that's why people came. That's why people all over the world, the best people all over the world came, because if you wanted to know science, no matter who you were, there was a moment like after the 60s when other people could come and American University really opened up and benefited from minds from all over the world. It was a very exciting place. You could do the best science there, you could do best social sciences there, you could do best debates. It was open, it was free, and merit was rewarded. So I think that it is a tragedy what's happening today. it's a tragedy for humanity, because that institution, I think, is dying. And I hope that Muslims can recover and or learn from it and recover our own traditions of free inquiry.
Building off of that, one thing that I want to talk about is the concept of Darul Islam and Darul Harb. Are we in Darul Harb living in America? Is that bifurcation maybe not the right way to think about it now, since modernity has changed a lot of the factors?
Let's first think about where does this distinction between Darul Islam and Darul Harb come from. It comes from the fact that Muslims live by a law, Sharia. Law requires power and authority in application. Now, if you go to any court anywhere, even if you go to parking ticket, the first thing they will ask you is that, does this court have jurisdiction over you? If a police officer gave you a ticket at a time when they were in a different place, even if they were one road over, that ticket is invalid because they're not in the jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a central problem in law. Darul Islam is an answer to the question of where do the Islamic laws, whether there's penal code and other norms, where do they apply? And Darul Islam is where they apply. So if you are outside of that, then Muslim imam and Muslim qadis, the judges and political authorities, cannot guarantee your rights. That's what it means that you are in Darul Kufr or Darul Harb, that you are no longer within the realm of Darul Islam, and therefore those rights do not apply. So if you erase this distinction, one of two things have to happen. One, you say the entire world has to be treated like Darul Islam, which means we should be going and establishing hudud in our garages, because it's an obligation to do what God says, and God says this is the punishment if somebody steals. But we don't do that. Why do we not do that? That's because of the distinction between Darul Islam and Darul Harb, or Darul Kufr, or Darul Da'wah. There are different names for it. But that distinction, I think, is very important. The other thing you could do is to say that Islamic law was never meant to be applied. It is merely a book of ethics, and you can leave anything that is inconvenient or interpret everything that you can't apply as a metaphor or something. Now, Muslim jurisprudence, Muslim tradition, never accepted that position. That would be considered really denying the Book of Allah, right? So, if you take Islam seriously, then accepting the distinction between Darul Islam and other abodes, other jurisdictions, is necessary. If a non-Muslim understands what these things are, they would demand that you understand us as not Darul Islam. Okay? So the problem is, in the apologetic, it sounded so bad that, this is the abode of war, the abode of unbelief, and therefore it was somehow seen by Muslim apologists as, an ancient distinction that no longer applies. But again, as I said, when you deny that, you're making one of those statements. Islamic law is never supposed to be applied. It's just a book of ethics. It's just a book of, like Confucius wisdom, or you are really trying to apply Islamic law everywhere, and the borders don't matter. But in classical jurisprudence, particularly for the Hanafis, those borders mattered. And for other schools, the borders mattered a little bit less, but they still mattered.
Got it. So then, now that we're living, like, I've seen some opinions in the past that said that you're not supposed to live in Darul Harb, you're not supposed to live in a land where Sharia is not being applied. Would the argument back to that be that there's no place where the Sharia is being applied, or there's no true Darul Islam in our current world, since there's no Khilafah?
So that's a very good question. Briefly, number one, Muslims are supposed to live in Darul Islam, that is true. But it's also the case that if they can practice their religion elsewhere, classical jurists said that they can live. And there is some disagreement between Malikis, Hanafis, Shafi'is, and Hanbalis on that. I don't want to go into the details. So basically, there were jurists in the past who said that if you could live somewhere else and make da'wah there, then you're allowed to, and some even said you're obligated to live there to make da'wah to people outside, right? So people went as far as saying that, so long as you're able to practice your religion.
Right.
So all of that jurisprudence is dependent on what you can do and your circumstances. And this is even assuming that there is Darul Islam waiting for you, where you can go move back and you will be okay, you'll be safe and provided for, you'll have a job and whatnot. When that's not the case, and that's not the case for a very large number of people, you know, but 30% of Muslims live as minorities in India, Russia, China, and the West is a minority, in fact. In these minorities, West is a small minority. What are these people going to do? What are 200 million Muslims in India going to do? Where are they going to go?
Right.
How about Russia? Was it 30 million? So I don't think that Muslims who are living in Darul Harb or Darul Da'wah, that's a new designation that some of the scholars have spoken about, and I like it, that this is a place where you invite people to Islam. And if you're able to practice your religion, then you're permitted to live there. And especially if you're able to help Islam by preaching Islam, by helping Muslims back home even, right? In many ways, the powers that Muslims have, the powers of citizenship, passports, the fact that you can move around the world. Muslims, the majority of Muslim countries can't move around the world. We have wealth and skills in the West that you don't have around the world. So I believe that we should do what we can. This is a collective thing, right? But as an individual, you as an individual may feel that your children are threatened, their iman is threatened, and in that case, it becomes your obligation to move or do whatever you can to save their religion. But if you are in the field of da'wah, and if you're in a strong community, and you're building and helping those communities, and your children see that and become part of it, and you're not worried about them losing their iman, and then there is no reason for you to move. Now, in reality, I will give you that many Muslims rightly feel that they're threatened here, and they can use some of the wealth that they have in the West to bargain for a safe space somewhere in the Muslim world, in the Gulf, in Turkey, Malaysia, elsewhere. And if they can do that, I think that's a decision they have to make on the basis of weighing pros and cons. And but a blanket statement is hard to make, precisely as you said. Even if you want to move back, most people cannot. There is no back for most people to move. Where Muslims in India have been there for 700 years, where are they going to move?
Yeah.
And India was ruled by Muslims, and now so we cannot solve this problem by this moving back or the mentality. We have to think about Muslims having the power to negotiate for the rights of Muslim minorities.
Right.
And that cannot happen unless we unite, unless we come together, unless we have economic, cultural, and political power.
Yeah. And even what you're mentioning about moving back, if I think for myself, I was born here, I was raised here, I speak English much better than I speak Urdu. And even though I've been to Pakistan many times and I can speak Urdu and get around there, I feel like I would be very ineffective there because I don't have that understanding of the culture as I do over here. So that may be also another reason why, even if we're thinking from an Ummatic perspective about how we can unite and bring like strategic change to Muslims, it might be better for people to find their best positions where they can be the most effective.
Yeah. You know, there was a time when Muslims thought about this, that, we're here, we're not going anywhere, we have to become good citizens. But we thought about it from a place of weakness and defeat, which is that we're giving up on the Muslim Ummah, we belong to America, we want to assimilate. And that was a mirage, that was a deceit. it was, America is a very divided place. And it has many crimes that it's committing now, it has committed in the past. But at the same time, America is a place where there is a fighting chance, there is civil rights movement, there is, there is history of racism, but there's also a history of struggle against it. There's history of xenophobia, but there's also a history of these great universities that I was just talking about. So there is a fighting chance.
Right.
What happened after 9/11 is that the American establishment lied to Muslims who were generally new and unsophisticated about America. And they told these guys that we are a united front. If you either are with us or are the enemy, you have to become like us. And poor Muslim uncles bought into that vision. So when they said we are becoming Americans, they thought that they have to become like this vision, this
American
idea,
dream.
American dream. And it's somehow necessary for them. They even went so far as to say this was our religious, they got some people to sign fatwas that it's our religious duty. Some even would say that it's a religious duty to fight in American armies, those all wars. And even if they're fighting other Muslims, you have to go join them.
Yeah.
There's fatwa like that
Wow.
around. In fact, I read in a fatwa that even if a Muslim soldier is fighting, he's not allowed to go to the back rows so that people, his compatriots, will suspect his loyalty. Like, this is the level of thinking. This is the jurisprudential thinking that was going on. But it was a sickness. Because apart from all the violation of everything Islamic, the duty to other Muslims, and the duty not to fight in unjust wars and not to kill other people, let alone other Muslims, all of that aside, this was a false vision of what America is. America is at war with itself. There are sides. And the question that Muslims have to answer is, how do you use that to help the situation, to do the right thing, but understand what the sides are. There's 1% against the 99%. Majority of Americans are oppressed people. We don't have to see them, majority of Americans, as the enemy. Their enemies, on the whole, are the same as the enemies of Islam. Those same people who have waged these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Palestine are also the ones now more explicitly waging war against their own people, the poor, the middle class, the blacks. So because we are able to see things much close, and we have, as a community, grown, we can choose our battles, and we can choose much better battles than the ones that post 9/11 leadership was trying to fight, which was against their own identity and trying to follow this mirage. So when I answer the question the way that I did, that there's no back home, my reason is the exact opposite of what they were saying. My reason is that we have to work on that home. We have to use the advantages that we have here to ensure that the Ummah is empowered and protected. Because in many ways, many of us who came from back home, but even if you're a convert, your loyalties should belong to the Ummah and not to the your own particular trajectory. You should think about empowering the Ummah. You should think about transferring the knowledge and the skills and wealth to the hundreds of millions of poor, starving people that are the target of American bombs and American policies, American coups, and American conspiracies, and generally colonial history of the last couple of centuries. We should think of ourselves as champions of the poor. Is that not also the most ethical thing to do, whether you are Muslim or not?
Right.
So I think that that's the vision I'm advocating, that's what being an Ummatic person today means, an Ummatic American Muslim or Western Muslim, is that we think of the Ummah as our as a project or a future without being out of place in America. We don't have to, and that in fact aligns well, because by standing up for the weak and the poor and the oppressed, you would be doing a favor to the United States as well, because the American policy of exploitation is very much, exploitation of the other people, other countries, comes back home. The same companies that are killing people outside, they come back and they turn against their own people. So we are, I think, at this moment where this has become clearer than ever before.
Right. It's great that we have you and your organization working on this, because one thing I've noticed being in the Muslim community is that there isn't much discussion about these topics. In fact, if we look at how Islam is taught in the West, a lot of times it's depoliticized, and we don't really focus on those issues. Even in fiqh, when someone's studying the abwab of fiqh, they'll go through all of the ibadat, but when it goes through the political issues, the governance issues, then you just speed through it and get through it. So in that sense, what would you say is the correct way of going about this? There's two approaches that I'm seeing from the Muslim community. One is that people want to focus on their spirituality, and then they're saying that an outcome of purifying yourself is going to be that it's going to fix our situation, we're going to get better leaders, we're going to get a better system that is in line with Islam. That's a more spiritual approach. The other approach that we're seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel that you are also a proponent of, is that if we have the Islamic system, it's not at odds with spirituality. You could have spirituality as well, but when you have an Islamic system, then that's going to facilitate a better society that's free from the corruption, the fahsha that exist, and then that's going to flow down into the spirituality as well. So how do we understand that division between politics and spirituality?
Funny you should say that, because in this Ramadan, I've been doing this series, Ummatics, on exactly on this question, what I call worship and world making. That's our series. I have 4 lectures on that. The 4th one is coming out, inshallah. Which is precisely to deconstruct this dichotomy, this false dichotomy between worship and world making. In our deen, in Islam, worship is not meditation on nothing. It's not Buddhist meditation on nothing. It's not running away from the world. It is an attempt to bring the world to Islam. That's part of our worship. To bring this world to Islam, to win this world over for us, for Allah. So, yes, our relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through salah and i'tikaf and through dhikr of Allah, those are all things that are central in our worship. But all of our pillars of worship require engagement with the community directly, or they require both directly and indirectly. So you cannot run away from the world in Islam. And you cannot say that, this dichotomy between, I'm going to be socially conservative, I'm going to pray in my mosque, and then I'm going to join this capitalist corporation that's maybe exploiting poor people or making weapons for somebody and so on. No, you cannot make that distinction. That you have to join the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do your best. And in that you will suffer, in that you will learn, in that you will recognize your own limitations as you're making da'wah, as trying to convince people, as you're being corrected by people, all of that. That is what Islam is. If you look at so much of the Quran, that's where the worship is. That's where taqwa of Allah is. That you're trying to make da'wah, you're trying to change the world for Allah. So I agree with the second of the options. I don't think there is any running away from the world in Islam, and that our worship is integrated. We learn our lessons when we are trying to husn al-khuluq, good character, right? That itself is an engaged form of worship. But if you, that husn al-khuluq, if that is because you're trying to bring people to Allah, you're saving them from Allah's wrath, that's the noblest thing you can do. That's part of our worship. Sometimes we need to focus on our one-to-one relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the month for that. Even though there are so many collective aspects of this month, but in our tahajjud, in our qiyam al-layl, in i'tikaf, there is a strong individual part, even though it's organized collectively. So even there is this collective. We don't run away from society. We don't run away from Muslims. Our world making is an important part of Islamic worship. And one Sufi saint once put it that Muhammad ﷺ, when God sent his message, God sent his light to him, and he came down from that mountain to the world. If God had sent me that guidance, I would never have come down, because that's what I'm looking for. That's all I want. I want the pain and the confusion of the world to go away, and I want to be one with God. Yeah. Whereas our deen is, that is where your mission starts. Once you have received that message from God, now you go and change the world. So the Prophet ﷺ never went back to the Jabal al-Nur, right? And that's a symbol of what Islamic worship is really about. It's with the people in your struggle, and the highest form of worship is for the people, or is that of the people who are engaged in that struggle.
That's a very beautiful statement and beautiful way to summarize the balance that exists between the way we engage with the material world and the spiritual world as well. When you look around in this country, Muslim communities, masajid, institutions, do you feel that there is a lack of discussion on the political and the world-making side?
I think that there is a lack because we are still recovering from 20 years of post 9/11 propaganda, but also it's not really over, and our imams are often terrified. And so I think that is true, but with the important caveat that I think that the reading of Quran and fiqh and classical books, and even the Arabic language or other languages of Islam, learning those skills, those are all part of what it means to become a robust ummah. So you can't be ummatic without Quranic teachers teaching tajweed and memorizing the Quran and helping people, teaching them sunnah.
Right, sets the foundation.
That's the foundation. So that need will never go away, and our ulama sort of retreat into that, because that's, no matter how, when the situation is bad, that's one thing they can do.
It's like a safer zone.
It's safer, and it's the foundation. That's one thing from which then the next generation can take on, right? There is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ who says that the example of my ummah is like rain, and some people are like barren land, and the rain just actually makes it even worse, because that the fertile soil is washed away. And for some people are like they reservoirs, they will hold the water for other people to come take. And some people are like fertile land, which takes the water, mixes it with the soil and the sun, and brings out the vegetation. And if you cannot be that vegetation, then you at least be a pond, right? And many ulama sort of go into that mode. And so I don't blame them for them. I think that's sometimes all we can do, right? I think this is not one of those times. Although people in India, for example, people may feel that way today. People are really facing a genocidal kind of situation, 200 million Muslims. And preserving the deen is all they can do. And we as a Muslim Ummah have a responsibility to them. But, so that's why I see it in a much more complicated light. I don't want to blame people, especially the ulama and the imams, given what they are wrestling with, their day-to-day problems. But I think that more young people who need to, young imams included, and young tullab al-ilm, students who are now in the seminaries and going to madaris and so on, need to empower themselves. Because I do see a crisis, I do see a problem. I do see many problems, but to point to one, which is the protests that are taking place for Gaza. The religious Muslim youth, especially religious Muslim males, were a conspicuous absence in those protests. Why are our boys not joining? They're not. Why are we not? They're not leading.
Well, they would argue that there's a lot of un-Islamic things happening, or like the leaders of those protests are often from the left side, who are also doing protests for LGBTQ and other related issues. Do you think that's to be considered at all?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if we want to, that's another discussion, but I would say that those are objections by people who are weak and insecure, and I don't mean to criticize them. They may be immigrants, or they may be somehow in other ways disempowered. But when you protest, you take charge. And I think that if you look at many of the stories of what was actually happening, where Muslims showed strength, they dictated the terms, and other people accepted their leadership. But when they didn't, other people took charge. And sometimes you need to, for one higher purpose, you collaborate with other people. So that's, there is we have a number of articles, and Yaqeen, I have one on this, Imam Tom Bikini has some on this, that we have, where we address this issue. But I think this is, more than anything else, a symptom of the lack of our political education, that we need to learn to fight. And I think that what Palestinians have shown us, and pro-Palestinian activists have shown us, is that you can change that narrative, a narrative as deeply embedded in America as pro-Zionist narrative. You can change that if you, if you stand up. And I think that the fact that many Muslims were afraid to speak about this, many mosques remained silent about it. Not mine. Alhamdulillah, I come from a community where we prayed qunut for 15 months, and every salah for Gaza, and we're very active. But there were many mosques that could not bring themselves to talk about this. So that is a symptom of that problem, and I think that is what work we need to do. We need to learn to talk about Ummatic issues on our own terms. So the problem that you raised is absolutely correct, that if the protest is on their terms, it seems that we're giving up something important, an important principle, by joining it. That's why we need to develop an Ummatic narrative for why, we're fighting for Quds, we are the rights of Muslims. What can be more Ummatic cause than that?
Right. The next thing I want to ask you is about tasawwuf and jihad together, because if we look in our history, some of the heroes that we think about, such as Salahuddin Ayyubi, he was known to be part of the Qadiriyya tariqa, and someone else such as Umar Mukhtar, You have also Imam Shamil, Uthman Danfodio. Imam Shamil, in fact, his soldiers were called the Murids. So there's always existed like this relationship between the Sufi and the Mujahid in one person. Now, in many ways, like Sufism has been seen as something that's pacifistic. It's been seen as people that work with governments. And so how do we understand that component? Has there been a change in terms of how Tasawwuf is understood?
So Tasawwuf is extremely diverse, and there have been all kinds of movements historically. But those that you pointed out are absolutely correct. But that's also true of other forms of Islam, no matter what group you see. There is no group that is secure against co-optation, whether Sufi or Salafi or Ash'ari or what have you. There is no group that is. So anybody or Sunni or Shia. So anybody who thinks that by joining this one group, I somehow do not have the responsibility to be self-critical, and to worry about co-optation, they are fooling themselves. And I'll leave it at that. I think that the issue of co-optation is one that has to do with, I think that we have a mistaken understanding of this kind of sectarian identity, where we believe that belonging to this one group is sufficient for me, right? I belong to the right group, and then my group is the right group. Whereas I believe that we need to have a dynamic understanding of truth, in which various groups of the Ummah are constantly reminding each other, correcting each other. Even if they are wrong in some parts of Aqidah, they may be the ones that are correcting somebody else, the mainstream or the dominant views. And therefore, the protection of this Ummah is in al-amru bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar, and commanding right and forbidding wrong, by the standards of what Allah has told us in the Quran and the authentic Sunnah, and our reason. So I believe that this sectarian narrative of belonging to the saved sect is very problematic. And that hadith that is often cited for this, that my ummah will be divided 73 sects, and then all are in hellfire except one. It's a weak hadith, although some people do it tasheeh, but I believe that the correct opinion is this is a weak hadith, and particularly the part that says all are in hellfire except one is the weakest part. There's no good isnad for it. And before sending all Muslims to hell, we should at least demand one sahih chain, right? I think that's not asking a lot. So I think that kind of thinking has harmed us, and we should try to avoid that, and we should be humble when others correct us.
Right. The last thing that I want to turn to is towards history, Islamic history, and what the importance of Islamic history is in fostering an Ummatic vision, because the more you have a shared memory, a shared culture, a shared language, then there's going to be more cohesiveness as well. So what would you say is the importance of learning our history?
Well, the way you put it is somewhat halcyonic. I mean, somewhat more positive than a lot of people take it, because there's a lot of conflict in history. And history is kind of like news. People report it only when there's something going wrong. So you have to be careful, because you could look at history and you can learn only about the parts where, you'll be selective and say all the things that your opponents did wrong, because that's what you were interested in learning about. So history is one thing, and good professional academic history that is fair, and it's methodologically sound, and it's learned in respectful debate, is another thing. And I think we need the latter. So doing history, but then is one thing. Doing good history, where history doesn't really teach you lessons. History only...
It's the data. Right?
It's a data, but you bring to it an aqidah. And that aqidah has to be that you're concerned for truth. And, you know, if you bring to an aqidah that you're right, everybody else is wrong, then all you're looking for in history is just those instances to this aha, that you could, you know, tweet at somebody. But I think that kind of history does harm. So, but when we look at history carefully and professionally and with integrity, as believers ought to, because we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I love, and I'm going to end with this, is the Sufis love this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-haq, the truth, the real. And I find, as a student of history and of Islam, Islamic theology, I find that name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most powerful, and one that we, through our scholarship, we worship Allah through that name. That Allah is the truth. So don't try to cheat, because when you look for al-haq, you will find al-haq. So take method and data and scholarship seriously, and try to be fair, and the best way to do that is, you know, try to root out your own biases and engage in debate and discussion, scholarly discussions, in a fair way. So you give others the same kind of benefit that you would demand for yourself. So if you say, for example, you know, things like Sunnis have always done this and Shia have always done this, well, actually look at that data. I think that both sides, you know, these days, you know, I'm witnessing these social media wars, and both sides are extremely unjust to each other. And I'm not just both sides, but all sides, not just the Sunni and Shia, but any division. Different lines are drawn between people, and that's a matter of fashion. So 5 years from now, it may be something else that people are fighting about. But whatever lines that we draw, people tend to be unfair. And religious people sometimes are more likely to be unfair if religion is a matter of identity for them. Religion has to be a matter of truth and commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But religious people often tend to fall into sectarianism.
Right.
And we should avoid that, because that's an enemy of scholarship, enemy of self-knowledge as well. And that's enemy of ummatic knowledge and ummatic action.
Jazakallah khair for your beautiful time and insights. Really enjoyed speaking with you. The last thing, if you could just share maybe what would be the best resources that people can go to if they want to get a better understanding of history and politics within the Islamic framework, and particularly for people who don't have a background. Like if someone's starting right from the basics, where would they go?
Well, that's a tough question. There isn't one source. I would say on our website, on Ummatics, we have a number of sources, and we are putting out curricula where people can actually go at whatever level they're at and start, to educate themselves, history, politics, aqidah, and other things. And we're trying to be fair and provide a large amount of resources and from different traditions. But when it comes to professional historical or available historical accounts, I'd say Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi's book, Saviors of Islamic Spirit, is a good start. It's written in good spirit. If you're trying to do theology, Sherman Jackson's book on Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering is a good introduction to various theological schools. If you're trying to do seerah, then I think the number of good ones have become available recently. But I'd say seerah is always a place to start. We should invest in learning seerah, and you can never learn seerah from just one source. Every account is selective.
Right.
But alhamdulillah, I think we have good ones available. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you. And we're very grateful for all the work that you're doing with Ummatics. Ummatic has become a very common word within the Muslim parlance now. I think just in the past week I heard someone use it, one of my friends, and I asked him, where'd you get this word from? And he couldn't mention your name. You don't even know. It's just it's become so prevalent that everyone's like mentioning this. I think
it's an idea whose time has come.
Yeah.
So it was a need. Like, we wanted to talk about ourselves.
Right. We didn't have the vocabulary.
Yeah.
Right. And I think Sami Hamdi was using it quite frequently. And since he was on the bigger podcasts, a lot of people started using it after that.
Yeah.
But alhamdulillah, inshallah, we're praying that your work is blessed and it brings a lot of good for the Ummah, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Sana wa yakum.